How is that, ladies and gentlemen? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. Thank you for such a great welcome. This is a very fun night tonight. I've been looking forward to this evening for a long time. I say that about a lot of these concerts, and I look forward to each one for different reasons. My name is David Gordon. I've been around this festival for a very long time, and my very favorite thing to do is what I'm doing right now. I have as much fun doing this as it seems. I really enjoy. I call it sharing my enthusiasms. We do lots and lots of concerts at this festival. This is my 24th festival. I started here as a tenor soloist. And of course, I'm going to like some more than others, but there's never been a concert at this Bach festival I can honestly say that I didn't like, whether I was in it or not. And part of it is the variety. Part of it is that the festival focuses on an area that really interests me. I sing or have sung in my career a wide variety of music. I was primarily an opera singer for 30 years. But I really love the music of the 18th century. I love to sing it. I love to hear it. And that is the central focus of this festival. But we are a chartered organization, and our charter says that our responsibility is to preserve, nurture, and perform the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, his contemporaries, and his cultural heirs. And the charter goes on into a vision statement that says that we should find ways to connect Bach with our modern lives. And that's what we're continuing to do, and that's one of the angles of tonight's concert. Although the biggest angle for tonight's concert is a perfect angle for a music festival, tonight's concert is fun. And it's also really, really great music making. And I want to tell you a little bit about the instruments that you're going to hear in this concert. But first, I have just a couple of announcements that I always make at this point. First of all, we do thank the folks up there. I thank my friend Jason and all the folks from AMP Media. ampmedia.org, ampmedia.org. You can go to their homepage, and there you can click on a little link that's right in the first paragraph of text, and that takes you to their YouTube list of all our videos. All the videos and events that happen in this room are preserved for all eternity on the internet. And you can watch them as many times as you want. If you find them interesting, I'd love to hear from you. If you find that they help you get to sleep at night, I'd prefer you keep that to yourself. I also wanted to point out to you, you still have 48 hours to visit our Art of Music art raffle. This is a tradition that's now in its 4th year, and it features more than 125 miniature artworks by artists throughout our region, and the art is inspired usually by the beauty of Carmel and by the excitement of this Bach festival. I was just up there a little while ago. I got here early and had a meeting that had been canceled, and my initial reaction was, oh darn, and then I thought, wait a minute, I'm in Carmel, California, and I have free time. Nothing is wrong with that picture. So I visited the art raffle again, and it's great. There's already several of the boxes up there that have my raffle tickets in them, so you'll be competing with me for a couple of things, but I've been a winner in the past, and you can too. Remember that you can buy your raffle tickets from volunteers who are in the bright fire engine red aprons, and if you have a color program book, there's a voucher in there for one free raffle ticket, so take advantage of that. The drawing will be on the 30th, and as they always say, you do not need to be present to win. So tonight, I was just telling someone that Mike Marshall and Katerina Lichtenberg played a concert at UC Santa Cruz in March. Just the two of them on stage for 2 hours. When I heard that they were going to be there, I decided I wanted to hear them because I knew very well who Mike Marshall is. I did not know the name of his wife, Katerina Lichtenberg. I certainly do now, and I've heard her playing, and it's absolutely stunning. So I went up there and introduced myself to them, and I realized that we were in for a treat because they're not only blindingly brilliant instrumentalists, they're also very charming, very down-to-earth people. And they're going to be introducing the various pieces of music that they're doing tonight. And so rather than talk to you about Vivaldi and Bach and the other composers who are on this concert, I want to tell you about the instrument, because this is the first time that this instrument has been featured in a main concert at the Carmel Bach Festival. And my story doesn't begin in the Baroque or in the Renaissance or in the medieval era. I'm going to go back about 15,000 years to a cave painting in the south of France of a man with what appears to be some kind of musical instrument formed by stretching a string between the ends of a bowed stick. No, he is not hunting. It's definitely not a hunting scene. And the archaeologists believe that this drawing, which dates somewhere between 15,000 and 8,500 BC, is perhaps the earliest illustration of a musical instrument. The earliest musical instruments were instruments that you blew through, perhaps an animal bone or a branch of a tree with holes in it, like the wooden flute that Janet C. demonstrated for us here on Monday night. Or it was some kind of an instrument that had a string stretched tight enough that the string would make some sort of sound when it was plucked, hit with a stick, or rubbed with something. And an increase in volume in this kind of early, let's call it an aboriginal instrument, was first obtained by holding the end of the bow against your teeth in your lower jaw and using your mouth as a resonator. I've tried that and it gets old really fast. Then, because a stick with a string attached, it's like playing an electric guitar when it's not plugged in. If an electric guitar that's not plugged in is basically a board with strings stretched on it, it makes hardly any sound. So people began to figure out ways to resonate and enhance the basic fundamental vibration of the string. And the commonest ways to do that in the early instruments were gourds or some kind of carved hollow wooden construction. More sophisticated stringed instruments appear in art around 2000 BC in Mesopotamia. Changes in pitch by that time were made by pressing the strings down on a flat area. And if you press the string down, you've actually shortened the length of the string that is vibrating, making the pitch higher. This is the basic way that a violin or a guitar works. You shorten the string by pressing it down on a fingerboard on the neck of the instrument. The strings were sometimes plucked by using the fingers and sometimes plucked by using a hard object or plectrum rather than the fingers, because the plectrum can produce a louder, sharper sound. And so at this point, I'm talking from now on about plucked stringed instruments, which includes the guitar, the lute, and the mandolin, as opposed to bowed instruments, which includes the viola da gamba and the violin family and so forth. By the 7th century AD, there was a folk lute in the eastern countries called an oud. The oud remains in use today, virtually unchanged in the music of the Near East, particularly in Armenia and Egypt. Oud is the Arabic word for wood. An oud is described by a Western musicologist as a wooden lute. The oud found its way into Spain during the Moorish conquest of Spain about 1,000 years ago. It made its way to Venice through the Mediterranean coastal trade, and it also came back to Europe with the returning Crusaders in 1099. There is a painting by the 14th century artist Agnello Gaddi that depicts an angel playing a miniature lute, a miniature oud called a mandora, M-A-N-D-O-R-A. The Arabs called it a dambura. The Spaniards called it mandora. The Italians called it mandola. The smallest version of the traditional mandola was called a mandolina by the Italians, and from that we derive the name mandolin. As the popularity of this instrument increased in the 17th and 18th century in Europe, it was very much Europeanized. It was very much westernized. It was brought into the same construction methods as the violins and the gambas of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. And as the instrument developed and became more sophisticated, Baroque composers wrote concertos for it. Vivaldi wrote 5 concertos for mandolin, and tonight's concert opens with one of those concertos, Vivaldi's concerto for 2 mandolins in G major. We are performing this Vivaldi concerto on the instruments for which it was written. All mandolins, regardless of shape or size or nationality, share one distinctive trait, and that is included under the umbrella heading mandolin. They are strung in what are known as double string or 2-string courses. A course is a pair of strings right next to each other that are pressed down with the left hand and played with the right hand as though they were one string. They're so close together, they are most often tuned to the same note. So the mandolin is to the hands a 4-string instrument, but it really has 8 pairs of strings, or 4 pairs of strings, 8 strings. I wasn't good in math in school. I've learned how to count to 4 and count to 3. I was going to call this, because each mandolin has 4 courses and there are 2 mandolins, I was going to call this an 8-course lecture. And they actually talked me out of it because they figured you'd expect food. It was kind of an oblique reference. So the mandolin is 4 pairs of strings. It's played like a 4-string instrument, but you press down the pairs of strings, the courses. And as I say, each pair of strings is treated by the fingers as a single entity. But because it is virtually impossible to tune both strings exactly to the same note, and we measure the distance between the distance between F to F sharp is measured in 100 steps called cents. And so your string might be 2 or 3 cents sharp or 2 or 3 cents flat, and we don't notice any bad intonation. We just notice a kind of a tang, a kind of a flavor to the sound, because the 2 notes are never exactly, precisely tuned to the same note. And the smallest mandolins, which are the ones that we are hearing tonight, like most of tonight's concert, are tuned exactly like the violin. The fingerboard is roughly the size of a violin fingerboard. It's a little bit wider. The fingerboard of the mandolin has frets in it, which are little bars of metal that separate the half steps, just like a guitar or a lute or a banjo. And so unlike the violin, which has no frets, it has a fretless fingerboard. And it's tuned like the violin. Both of the small instruments that you'll see, and I'll differentiate them in a minute, are tuned exactly like the violin, G, D, A, E. So violin concertos and violin sonatas are great to play on the mandolin because the movement of the left hand is almost exactly the same whether you're playing the violin or the mandolin. Mandolins come in several forms, and tonight we see beautiful iterations of those 2 forms, the European style and the American style. Caterina is playing a modern German instrument, a replica of an Italian mandolin, a replica of an 18th century Italian mandolin. It's made, though, deliberately a little bit larger to accommodate larger 21st century concert halls. Her mandolin is modeled on the traditional Neapolitan style mandolin, which has a round back like a lute. It's known as a round back or bowl back mandolin, and the vernacular name in the United States is a potato back mandolin or a tater bug. I would never dare to refer in Caterina's presence to her beautiful instrument as a tater bug, although I bet Mike Marshall would. It has a vaulted back, which is made of tapered strips of wood. It's a very familiar construction to us if you look at any of Dan Swenberg's great lutes and theorbos that he brings to the festival. These strips of wood are tapered, and it creates this beautiful bowl on the back of it, which resonates the sound. This is the traditional European form of the mandolin, But things changed in America about 100 years ago. The mandolin was brought into the mainstream of popular American culture by immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. It first appeared in America, it first came into vogue in the 1850s when it shared the parlors with zithers and parlor guitars and ukuleles and other novelty instruments that were promoted to amuse an increasingly leisured middle class. There was a marked increase in Italian immigration in the 1880s, and that sparked a new wave of popularity for the bowl-backed Neapolitan-style instrument. The mandolin was one of the first instruments to be recorded by Thomas Edison on his wax cylinders. By the turn of the century, mandolin ensembles were touring the vaudeville circuit. Mandolin orchestras were forming in schools and colleges. You could buy a mandolin from the Sears Roebuck catalog or the Montgomery Ward catalog. You could buy guitars, auto harps, and banjos from both of those catalogs as well. And mandolins proliferated throughout the United States. Banjo, that is tenor banjo, four-string banjo, mandolin, and guitar clubs had become the rage among middle-class youth on college campuses and in towns and cities, especially throughout the South. And a variety of playing styles were made available and taught in instruction books and on early recordings. Now, I mentioned the traditional Neapolitan bowl-back, round-back mandolin that Katerina's playing tonight. One man can be credited with developing the alternative style of mandolin construction of the instrument that Mike is playing. Same strings, same tuning, same playing technique. Everything about it is the same, except the shape of the body is very, very different, and it is an entirely different type of construction. It was all started by a guy named Orville Gibson. He was born in New York in 1856, and his name is well known to anybody who's ever picked a guitar. He moved to Kalamazoo, Michigan as a young man, and he began there a workshop where he designed and built guitars and other plucked stringed instruments in the 1880s. His early instruments were very avant-garde, they were highly experimental, and they were often extremely ornate. And in his mandolins, Orville Gibson departed radically from the traditional bowl-back design brought to America by the Italian immigrants. Instead of having a flat spruce top and a rounded back, Orville Gibson's new mandolin design was based on the principles of violin construction. It had a carved, arched maple top with two F-holes in it, just like a violin, and a carved, arched maple back. It was a heavier construction, and the new design featured more sturdy wood. The carved wood itself was more durable, and it had more sturdy bracing inside. The ribs and bracing inside were more substantial. And so it could accommodate higher string tension, and slightly thicker metal strings could be put on it, which produced a really full, well-balanced tone with very great carrying power. And this brings us to the magic decade of the American mandolin. In 1922, Orville Gibson hired a man to examine the acoustic principles of all his instruments. He was an acoustic engineer hired by Gibson, and his name was Lloyd Lohr. And he came in and he revamped the design and specs of the mandolin line of the Gibson Company. The new versions had a number of very distinguishing features, including an adjustable neck. There's a truss rod inside the neck that allows you to adjust and compensate for dryness and humidity. It had an adjustable bridge. It had much more ornate scrolling of the body, beautiful ornate carvings, and carvings up here around the peg heads where the tuners are. And perhaps his greatest achievement was the design of Model F5. This is still considered to be one of the great mandolins. It is still being made today. During Lloyd Lohr's half-dozen years with Gibson, there were approximately 175 F5s that were signed on the label inside the mandolin by Lloyd Loar. Those instruments are like the Stradivarius of mandolins, and Mike Marshall, of course, is playing on one of those instruments. I've played two of them in my life. I play the mandolin. I played two of them in my life, and it's like you're playing a piece of history. The great Lloyd Loar held this instrument, approved it, signed the label, and they stuck it inside. And there's his signature and his date. It's still, the F5 is an absolute classic instrument for American mandolin players, and it is one of the great mandolins produced anywhere in the world. That basic design of Orville Gibson and Lloyd Loar in the 1920s became the benchmark for all mandolin players in North America. The American manufacturers gave up the Neapolitan style, which is harder to hold, and you have to play it sitting down, for one thing. The Neapolitan instrument must be sort of held in your lap, whereas the F5 mandolin, which has a relatively flat back, can be put around you with a strap or a string, just like the banjo or the guitar, and you can stand up and play it. And as I say, Mike is playing one of those instruments, and it's an old, beat-up thing. It's an old, beat-up instrument. It has been around the block about 1,000 times. And they have a sound that is unmistakable. They have a sound that is magical. The sound that comes out of it is big and vibrant and has a wonderful, wonderful personality. In addition, Mike is playing tonight on an instrument called a Mandocello. This is a mandolin that is about the size of a guitar, but it is tuned like a cello. All the mandolins I've mentioned so far on stage tonight have metal strings. Caterina will use one other instrument, which is a replica of an early Baroque mandolin, which looks a little bit more like a small guitar. It has gut or nylon strings, and they'll mention these instruments as they go through the concert. So I've talked about the man who recreated the mandolin for North American players. Now let me tell you about the man who revolutionized the way Americans play on the F5. As the popularity of mandolin orchestras and the mandolin and parlor instrument in the United States, the mandolin as a parlor instrument in the United States began to wane in the 20s and 30s, it began to take a backseat to other instruments. The old-time country music of the 30s and 40s, there was sometimes a mandolin present, but it was generally a kind of a rhythm accompanying instrument. It was not a lead instrument, and it did not play the melody. And all of that emerged with the birth of William Smith Monroe in Kentucky in 1911. I cannot tell you, after 24 years at the Bach Festival, what a surprise it is that I would stand here and mention the name of William Smith Monroe, who is one of my personal heroes. I heard him perform many times. I listened to him as a kid. Certainly he's an acquired taste, but I acquired that taste, and he's one of my great heroes. He was born in 1911 on his family's farm in Rosine, Kentucky, the youngest of 8 children. His mother and her brother, Pendleton Vandiver, were both musically talented, and Monroe and his family grew up playing and singing music at home. Because his older brothers, Birch and Charlie, had first dibs on fiddle and guitar, Bill Monroe was resigned to playing the less desirable, less interesting mandolin. But something happened that changed the course of music history. As so often I tell here in this, standing on this spot, something happened. Something happened that changed everything. Monroe's mother died when he was 10. His father died when he was 16. He bounced around between uncles and aunts, living in various homes, and then he settled in with his uncle Pendleton, Uncle Penn. And Uncle Penn was disabled and earned his money by playing fiddle for hoedowns and square dances. And young Bill accompanied Uncle Penn, took him to these hoedowns and square dances and parties, and Uncle Penn gave Monroe a repertoire of tunes and a sense of rhythm that absolutely seeped into his bones. He was also influenced at an early age by an itinerant black blues player with the unlikely name of Charles Schultz, who would who would pass through town from time to time. And Monroe was fascinated by the way Schultz would bend the notes and make them sound all bluesy. As a young man, Bill went on the road with his older brother Charlie. Bill on mandolin and Charlie on guitar. They were a very, very famous brother act. There were lots and lots of duo brother acts in those days. But in contrast to the sweet kind of Venetian gondola tremolo style that most people used on the mandolin, Bill played in a fiery, rapid style that brought a power and urgency to the music that had never been there before. No one had ever heard a mandolin played like this anywhere. Monroe fused his two childhood influences, his Uncle Pen, for whom he wrote a very famous song that is beloved to bluegrass aficionados, and Arnold Schultz, the blues man. Uncle Pen's fiddle-playing style gave Bill Monroe his intricate mandolin-playing inspiration. And through the influence of Arnold Schultz, the blues man, Monroe spiced his playing with blues notes and blues turns. And the fusion of these influences created, in the 1940s, an unmistakable style that has influenced every American mandolin player since then. Every American mandolin player is under the influence of Bill Monroe, who died about 10 years ago or so, just the way every classically trained musician is influenced by Johann Sebastian Bach. As radio swept the country in the 1940s, Bill Monroe's new style of mandolin playing was getting to a lot of people via the airwaves. And people responded to the raw emotion of Monroe's playing. And the Monroe brothers, Bill and Charlie, became one of the more popular brother acts of the 40s. Charlie died of lung cancer, and Monroe went on to form a band. And this band was mandolin as a lead instrument with 5-string banjo, fiddle, guitar, and bass. This was at a time when the electric guitar was becoming popular in country music and rock and roll, and Monroe refused to have anything to do with that. He refused to electrify his band. They played completely unamplified, and they were best when they all used one microphone, one of those old Shure microphones like they used to have when we were all in high school, you know, those big ones like this. Imagine mandolin, 5-string banjo, fiddle, guitar, and bass all trying to sing and play into that one microphone. It was like a ballet. I've seen it many times. Monroe refused to electrify. Without electric instruments, he created a new high-energy genre of American folk music. It's been called folk music with overdrive. In honor of his native Kentucky, the bluegrass state, he called his band the Bluegrass Boys. And the name of the band ultimately lent its name to the whole genre of music, bluegrass music. This music was essentially invented by Bill Monroe and had as its center not the banjo, not the fiddle, but the mandolin. So tonight's concert encompasses the old and the new, the traditional and the modern. You will hear only a very brief medley of music that actually was written by Bill Monroe. But when you hear the movement from Mike Marshall's Mandolin Concerto, it's clearly derivative of Monroe's writing. And when you hear Mike Marshall play the mandolin, you know that long before he ever played classical music on his instrument, he was playing bluegrass in the style of Bill Monroe. The Italian mandolin, the American mandolin. Caterina is pregnant. She smilingly said that if you play the instrument long enough, you begin to look like the instrument. It's so sweet. When I saw her, she was pregnant when I saw her in March, and I didn't know that she was pregnant then, and she's very pregnant now. She's such a sweetheart. You're going to just love these two people. One instrument has existed in its current form since the 17th or 18th century. That's the one that Caterina's playing. The other instrument is a purely unique American invention of the 20th century. It's an Orville Gibson, Lloyd Loar invention that some 25 years after its invention, somebody came along who figured out what to do with it, and that was Bill Monroe. The European instrument has a slightly more gentle, sweeter tone. The American instrument has a fuller, more penetrating and aggressive sound. These two wonderful people will become your best friends very quickly, as will the adventurous players on the stage. Keep in mind that there are 6 of our players on stage with them, including harpsichord. You're going to hear some really stupendous and stylish Baroque music making tonight, and you're also going to hear some music that is just unbridled fun, and a lot of music that connects these two genres, which is what we look for in our Thursday night concerts. To tell you about the one piece that they can't tell you about, of course, Vivaldi, one of the inventors of the modern concerto. They'll walk on stage tonight and begin playing the Vivaldi Concerto for 2 mandolins. Vivaldi was a very famous violin soloist, and he's the pioneer of the genre of the solo concerto as opposed to a concerto grosso, which is a larger group and a smaller group. The solo concerto is 1 or 2 or 3 primary soloists. And this was Vivaldi's contribution. He was a contemporary of Bach. He was very famous in his day. The Venetian public outgrew their love of his music. He decided to go to Vienna because he had curried favor with the emperor in Vienna, but soon after he got there, the emperor died, and Vivaldi had sold all his music to get to Vienna, and he died penniless and was buried in an unmarked grave in Vienna. It wasn't until 1939 that people discovered his music. Until 1939, most of what people knew about Vivaldi, they knew because Bach loved the music of Vivaldi. And Bach copied a lot of concertos by Vivaldi, which in the early days of Bach research, people thought were by Bach at first. Then in the 1930s, another one of those events that changed everything, somebody literally found a box full of all of Vivaldi's music. The Gloria, his operas, his concertos, a box of music. They had a whole week-long festival in Italy in, I think, 1939, unveiling all of this music that had not been heard since Vivaldi was alive. And all of that music, I would say 90% of what we know of Vivaldi today, came out of that box. How lucky we are. The other 18th century composers on tonight's concert are Johann Sebastian Bach, Jean-Marie Leclerc, and Domenico Gaudioso. In addition, you'll be hearing music by 20th century composers, including works written by Mike and Katerina themselves. I commend this concert to you. It's fun. It's also really great music making. And I hope you enjoy these wonderful, colorful instruments that I personally and professionally am very glad we are introducing to the Bach Festival main concerts. I will be back here tomorrow night for my last lecture of the Bach Festival before our symphony concert. And as always, I thank you very much for giving me the time. Thank you and have a great evening.